The First World War had massive political effects for every nation involved. The major empires of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire had collapsed, leaving chaos in their wakes. Russia's Tsar had been overthrown through the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and in Germany, as defeat became inevitable, the Kaiser was overthrown. As you will learn in this unit, those responsible for establishing peace and creating treaties that would buttress peace had an exceptionally difficult task ahead of them. First, we'll look a bit at the background to these peace settlements. In January of 1918, nearly a year before the war ended, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson presented his vision for the future and his post-war goals. Wilson's speech to Congress detailed his 14 points. These points, Wilson hoped, would be the basis around which peace negotiations would focus. Let's look closely at each of the 14 points. The first point was no secret treaties and alliances between countries. The goal here was to prevent another triple alliance or triple entente, which Wilson believed were the major contributing factors to the outbreak of the war. The second point was freedom of the seas for all nations in both peace and war. This was developed as a result of the German U-boat warfare, which was responsible for sinking many American ships prior to U.S. involvement in the war. The third point was the removal as much as possible of trade barriers between the nations. Wilson advocated free trade to prevent protectionist policies that would upset other nations. The reduction of armaments by all nations was the fourth point. The point was against the militarism and arms race which helped spur on the war. The fifth point was the adjustment of colonial claims, including the wishes of those being colonized and the colonial powers. So this was to help prevent the imperialistic attitudes that helped promote the war by really clarifying the claims on colonies that each nation made, and also keeping in mind that the people who were being colonized were directly being impacted by these decisions and that their wishes needed to also be considered. The sixth point was Russian inclusion in the peace negotiations and return of all Russian territory lost in the war. Russia would, however, after Wilson made the announcement of the 14 points, Russia would make a peace treaty with Germany to end the war and actually lost a lot of territory. So this point would come back in again as the war actually ended. Point 7 was the restoration of Belgian territory. Belgium was to get back any territory that it had lost during the war. Point 8 was that France should be fully liberated, its territory restored and allowed to recover, especially the Alsace and Lorraine region. So France would get back any of the territory it lost in the Franco-Prussian War, plus territory that had been lost through the war itself. Point 9 was that all Italians were to be allowed to live in Italy, and Italy's borders were to be drawn along clearly recognizable lines of nationality. This point was to resolve the issue of other nations claiming the territory around Italy. Wilson called for nationality and language to determine the national borders for Italy. Point 10 was self-determination should be allowed for all those people living in the Austria-Hungarian Empire. This point called for the breakup of the empire and allowing the people who lived in that empire to form their own independent nations and governments. 11 was self-determination and guarantees of independence for the Balkan states and its borders to be redrawn, with Serbia getting access to the sea. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro were going to be given full independence and not be claimed by any rival European nation. Remember, disputes over this area directly ignited World War I. Point 12 was self-determination for Turkish people and non-Turks under Turkish rule, and free passage to the Dardanelles. Once the Ottoman Empire fell, it became possible that the European powers would attempt to carve up the territory that was the former Ottoman Empire, and this would potentially lead to more disputes with each other. To prevent this, Wilson called for independence for the people who lived in this territory completely without having to be concerned about European involvement. Point 13 called for an independent Polish nation, which would also have access to the sea. Before this, Poland was not a nation, it was just a region. So this called for Poland actually officially becoming a country. And point 14 called for the creation of a League of Nations, which would guarantee the political and territorial independence of all states involved in the League of Nations.